Okay, so I said I would go through the week 1 activity 9 activity, the float activity, float layout activity. So I have it here open in my Visual Studio Code, just that activity. I've made a copy of the unsolved folder, which I'm going to do a version of it with Clearfix. But let's start with the one that you were given. And I'm going to do it in a way that I don't need to change the HTML file whatsoever. So hopefully you've seen the video I did recapping what floats are, and I think it's a better description of how floats work. And building off of that, let's go ahead and get started with this. So I'm not going to change this HTML at all, but I will open it up. Let's open it up in Live Server. It's now over here on this side. Okay, so this is what we get for default. These are a bunch of block level elements that are just stacked on top of each other. So in order to distinguish them, let's copy and paste these colors into our CSS. So the first element is that this section, if we look in our, this is the section that's left, the section that's middle, the section that's right. We can actually take the colors right from here and apply them like this. So this is, we're going to give it a background, got to spell background right, background color of this weird number. I'm going to save this, and if I look, you'll notice that the background color is applied. Block level elements go from edge to edge of the browser, so that's why you see this whole thing. The body usually comes with some margin around the edges, so my guess is that's what that white is there. If you have any curiosity about it, go investigate this stuff on your own. You'll find that it's actually more rewarding to do what I'm doing on your own. Okay, so I'm going to apply the same style here. I just want to grab these colors. So I'll grab this color and grab and put it there. Grab this color, copy, and put it here for paste. Now I'm going to save this CSS file, look at my document, and you can see it's been updated. Let's just continue doing this with all of these pieces. So here I am in the aside, so I can copy that and put the aside, needs a background color, paste, and we need the hashtag for adding hexadecimal colors. I'm going to copy this code so I don't have to type as much. If I copy the same code, you'll notice that, yeah, these are all the same colors. I just don't have to type as much. So this color is applied, it's meant to be applied to this section, to the full. So I'm going to come into full and paste it there and get the division, get its color, and paste it here. The aside, I've already given it its color, and now let's put this footer color on the footer. Save it, take a look at it, and as you'd expect, these are all block level elements. They are stacked on top of each other. That is the normal flow for block level elements. So now we are going to adjust these sections at the top to be floating so that they can stack horizontally as opposed to vertically. In the process, what they'll do is make everything else after them float around them. And you'll notice at this point, these sections are all full width. Once we apply float left to them all, they will stack against each other horizontally, right? But their width changed. So by putting float on them, we've taken off that normal behavior for blocks to have a width that's 100%. Their width now is the width of the content that is in them. So we need to attach or hard code in a width for them. Our diagram that we're trying to duplicate, which is over here, is we want these to stack up a third of the screen each. So if a screen is 100%, one time it may be 100 or 10,000 or 1024 pixels, another time it may be 980 pixels, but it will always be 100% wide. we can take 100% and divide it by 3, which means the width of each of these is going to be 33%. Width is a property, a CSS property, and we can use percentages as a measurement. So I will apply a percentage width to each of these. So now if we look at this, they are a third across. Our aside is still kind of around the side here. So it's because these are floating. The aside is still being affected by that float. So as we talked about in the float video, or as I talked about in the float video, we want to clear that float. So the element that comes after right is full. So I can just attach clear both to that, and it will clear the floats that these are doing. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a clear both on full. Spell it right. There, you see how that little green over there isn't there anymore. And I wonder why this is still got that little gap there. Maybe it's because we didn't do 33 1/3, which is the true width. You know, and I don't know how many decimal points. Honestly, I just don't know. And that's a truer width. You can see it goes to the edge. Yeah, that looks like that nailed it. Cool. So these sections are now the right width. They're stacked up against each other, but they don't have the color wrap around them, right? We want that color to be wrapped around them very much like in the diagram. See how these have this color? Well, as I talked about in class, the way we can do that is by adding padding. So if we add a padding of 20 pixels, it's like adding fat to them. That's my best description of it. It's the space between the content and the border. That's what the padding is. So now that I've done that, we've given these guys some fat. One way to inspect that is if I right click them and I've chosen the right one. See how the blue, there's blue in there. That's the content. The green is the padding. I'll select the middle one so you can see. And this corresponds to what is if I click this computed tab. See how the blue is the content. The padding is the green. The border, we don't really see a border, and it doesn't have any margin at this point. So if we look at our example that we're trying to match, there's a white space. So we already have the white space between the header and those sections, but we don't have it below. So the white space would be the sections pushing away from the next piece, right? The piece that's already been cleared. So let's do that. Let's actually add a margin bottom to the section. In fact, you know what? Let's apply it to all sections. So every single section in our document is going to have a margin bottom, not bottom, of 20 pixels. So that includes the left. If we look, how many sections we got? Left, middle, right, and full will all have a margin bottom. So this is kind of what we want anyway, right? Because there's a margin underneath this section too. Cool. Whew. Wow, we're doing pretty good. So right now, if we look at this diagram, this aside is over to the left and it has a certain width and height. Let's float the aside, and let's float it and let's give it some height. So we'll attach a height, we'll hard code a height to it. Let's go to our CSS. Here is the aside. So first thing we'll do is we'll float it to the left, and then we'll give it a height. Well, first we do want to give it some padding, just like we gave to the other ones. Give it a little fat so it looks like it's wrapped in color. This is the trick for making things look like they're wrapped in color. You give it padding. So we'll give it the same 20 pixel padding. We'll save that, take a look at it. Okay, so it's floated all the way. You'll notice that the section, which is its container, has not expanded to handle the overflowing floated item. And the div that came before is also, it looks like it's stacked right next to it. But as we'll see in a second, it's actually behind it. So, and the thing that's pushing the div from being all the way to the top is this little piece of content. So that text has height, and that is, it needs to be accommodated. So it's what's keeping this block level element from pinning itself to the roof of its containing section. So if we look at our example again, so the aside needs to be away from the left wall a little bit. So we can use, if you remember, padding is like adding fat to an element. Margins is like using force fields, right? So let's put a left margin on the aside to push it away from the side of the of the container. And we can also put a margin on the top and one on the bottom if we want. So let's actually go through that. On the aside, let's put a margin, and let's use that. Let's use those four. Remember, it's top, right, bottom, left. It's clockwise. So let's put a 20 pixel margin on the top. On the right, we don't really need a margin, so I'm just going to put 0 there. On the bottom, we'll put the same margin. And on the left, let's make it a different margin. Let's make it 50 pixels. So if I save that, you can see that the aside has now moved over a little bit. And now you can also see that the div is actually behind the aside. It's really interesting. That division is behind the aside. The section has not handled the overflow of this aside yet. So a couple things we need to do. Let's look at our example. So this section is not at the edge of its color. So as we've been doing with everything else, we could add padding to the full section to make sure we give it this space here. So that's what I'm going to do now. It'll also create some space here and should create some space here. So let's create a padding on section full. Padding. That's not how you spell padding. Padding of, looks like it was a little higher on the top. Let's do 30 pixels on the top, and let's do 20 pixels on the right. I don't remember what the bottom looked like. Oh, you know what? The top and the bottom are actually the same. It looks like it's 20 pixels all the way around. So I'm going to change my mind, get rid of that, and it's 20 pixels all around. So now if we look at our result, cool, we got some padding here and some padding here. It also looks like maybe we didn't need that margin on the aside because the section padding pushed it down some more. So there's, if we look and inspect, let's take a look at our aside. The orange in the overlay orange shows the margins of the aside, and you can see that it's pushing up against the padding that is in the section full. So we don't really need this margin, the top margin for the aside. So I'm going to go take that off. Top, right, bottom, and left. So I'm going to take this one. I'm actually going to make it 0. Look at what we got now. That looks a little bit closer to what we're dealing with over here. We may be too far over. You know, maybe 50 was too much. Let's see what we're doing here. Go back to the CSS. Take off the 50. Let's make it 30. That probably is closer to what we want. See how I'm tweaking this to get where I want? That seems a lot closer. But our section still isn't handling the overflow of this thing. I guess the last one, before we start handling that, let's take a look at this div. What can we do to the div to make it look closer to? So the div needs padding. That's something we could do. This piece of text also looks like it needs some spacing. I wonder if I add a margin to the div, if that would actually make it create this space. That's what I'm going to do. So division needs some padding. Padding of 20 pixels. And we're going to give it a margin, and I can specify specifically that I want to apply it to the top. And look at that. So it did push this down. This looks good. Our aside doesn't really have the same height and width as what we have here. So things I could do, I could hard code a width, which I think I might do, and a hard code a height. So let's do that. On the aside, let's hard code. When I say hard code, meaning I'm going to specify exactly how wide I want it. which means in this case I can specify an actual pixel width. And the height feels more like 250. If I save that, oh, that's the width as well. We have to actually put height in here. That looks a little better. Maybe a little too much. Let's do 200 or maybe 150, whatever. It really doesn't matter. The idea is that this thing is still overflowing everything that comes after it. That is because we haven't cleared this fix at all. In fact, it's overflowing on top of the footer. Now, there are three ways you can clear a fit or clear a float. Clear a fix. Clear a float is that I can apply a clear fix to a container, the thing that contains the floating things. Well, we don't have that container. We're trying not to do that. We're trying to do everything with just CSS. And the other thing I could do is I could create a little HTML element that goes after the floaty stuff and clear it. But again, we're not trying to, or we're trying not to change the HTML. We're trying to do this all in CSS. So the only other way that's left is we can say the thing that's containing the aside and the division, we can set its overflow to auto. I save that. Now the container knows how to deal with this thing. It's handling its overflow. Everything that's inside of it can now be handled. This is getting really close. The last thing to do is to give the footer some fat. So this is where we take this and we add some padding and pad it 20 pixels. Save that. And gosh darn it, looks pretty close. Now again, our example has different colors, but the layout's the same. If I know that the picture is smaller, but this is where this comes in. See how my display size is changing, and it actually looks a lot closer to our example. We just have some different colors. There's a different height here. Our font sizes are different. I'll leave it to you guys to mess with this and change the colors and what have you. So, okay, this is an example of how to do it without changing the HTML. But we were taught this thing about that ClearFix class. So let's actually, so I can save some time, I'm going to copy all of this CSS. I'm going to bring it over into this ClearFix example. But instead of using the overflow here, and instead of clearing the full, we'll take those out because we're going to use ClearFix. So now if I look at this, and this is my old, I got to actually open up the new one here. Let's open this up. Haven't changed the HTML yet. So, a couple things. We lost our margin here, right? It's because these things are still floating. They're still floating. It means they really don't have any height. Their container has a height of nothing because there's nothing in its container except these things. So they are just overflowing their container. This is overflowing because again we took off all of the clears. We're going to use ClearFix instead. So in order to use ClearFix, let's start with the sections. We need to wrap them in a div. Remember how I said divs are just kind of like these utilitarian, they're just utilitarian divisions in our web page. They're the things we use to define structure. Oops, I closed it in the wrong spot. We need all three of those sections in here. I'm going to save it. When I save it, great, my code formatter is doing a great job. Now, this on its own doesn't change anything. See, it's still the same. But if I come in here to my CSS, I'm going to add a very special class called ClearFix. .ClearFix. I gotta spell it right. So the way ClearFix works actually is it uses a pseudo element that comes after the element to which this class is applied. So there are a couple of pseudo elements. One of them is after, one of them is before. you can't just make up your own name. Those are actually part of what the browser knows what to do. And what it does is it actually inserts a sort of element. It doesn't have all the features of a regular element, but it has some of the layout abilities. So with this pseudo element, we got to give it a little content. In this case, nothing. We don't have to. That's an empty string. There's no space in there, but it's enough to establish the pseudo element inside the document. It's telling the browser to draw it. Because it's now in the document, we can give it a display context of block. So it'll behave like a block level element. And because it's a block level element now, we can tell it to clear. So this is saying when we apply this to the container, which is our container right here, we're going to give it a class of clearfix. It's as if we're inserting an element right here on line 18 that has clear both attached to it. It's exactly like that. So when I hit save here, you can see we got our margin back, and all of these elements have cleared this float. It's a lot cleaner than a lot of other ways of clearing floats, and therefore it's my preferred way of doing it. It also specifies that by doing this, what I'm doing is I'm containing all of my floating within a container. Okay, it feels like I have more control over the layout process, because no matter what I float in here, what comes after this container will be safe. It will actually go back into the normal flow. Now that said, inside section full, we've got a floating item. So I'll just apply clearfix to that too. I save this. Uh-oh, what happened? That is not what I expected. Oh, you know why? Duh. Look at that. So here's an example of, it's a very common error. I put the clearfix inside the ID attribute. You only get one ID. So what I just did is I screwed up a couple things. It's as if I renamed this ID for this section, and I didn't apply the clearfix. So take it out of there. I need to put in a class attribute inside these quotes, save that. Now we're getting the behavior we want. So this should be the same effect as what we did without changing the HTML. Let's open this live server. So yeah, they look exactly the same. So two different ways to do the exact same one. Which is right? You know, it really doesn't matter in a way. It's like it still works. That's what I like about code, is if it either works or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you get a lot of people yelling at you. like today, I've got stuff wrong at work. So, but there are things that are probably better and less better. So for me, in my opinion, and you'll find developers have opinions on stuff, I prefer the clearfix way. I think it's cleaner. I think it's easier. It's more controllable. It's easier to support, right? So that when the next person grabs my code, they'll understand clearfix, even though it's a handmade class, it's not part of any spec anywhere, it's just using things. Clearfix is a standard that people use all over the web, so they would know what that meant. Okay, so with that, that is activity 9 from week 1. And I will upload this, and I will see you in the next class.